from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. And you know, it was interesting. I started out this morning and I was going to talk about Europe and kind of get away from Iran and everything everything focused on that. And like so many other times, global events, things happening in Washington, D.C. and overseas kind of overcame my intent to refocus away from the Middle East. And I'm sure there are many who would say we've tried to be refocusing away from the Middle East for many years, and we keep getting pulled back in. Well, I got pulled back in for this, and I'm going to talk about this weekend, this coming week, and what is essentially what I think is a strategic inflection point, which is a way of saying that things going forward will not be the same as they were up to that point. And I think that's fair to say with whatever happens in the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran, and what's happening in the Middle East altogether because of what's occurring. And that's a big change. That's a very big change from what we've seen. We've seen a kind of a status quo, some would say probably a dithering during this ceasefire of where we're going, and a lot of hopeful talk that doesn't seem to achieve anything at all. But I think at this point, we're kind of hitting what has to be a shift one way or the other. So let's talk about this. We're at a precipitous point with this conflict with Iran. Either we're going to come out with something that might be a framework for an agreement, or we may be returning right back to the conflict itself, kinetic action, strikes, everything else that happened in Iran. And now, let's talk about that kinetic action, a return to military strikes, what that may look like. Well, the phrase with the famous Roman general Varius, as he was being destroyed by the Germanic tribes way back when, it was said that he had turned and said, "Not like yesterday." In other words, that all the conquests of Rome in that area before, that this was not like those previous conquests. And of course, his legions were completely decimated, wiped out. Well, I should say just destroyed. And so it was not like yesterday. Well, I think that whatever goes forward will not be like yesterday. I would be surprised if the planners at U.S. Central Command and elsewhere are just saying, hey, let's just keep doing what we were doing. I would imagine that there were some courses of action developed which were to kind of change things. And they certainly have had time to work on a number of these detailed plans. Certainly had a lot of time to coordinate with our allies in the Gulf and maybe even outside the Gulf on things that could be done going forward if no agreement can be reached with Iran. And so I don't think it'll be like yesterday. All right. There is a potential, significant potential, if things kick off, that we will see boots on the ground. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be an invasion force taking over Iran. There are reasons why. And say, well, we did this with Iraq in 2003. Yes, but Iraq is not Iran. It's not Iran in terms of Iraq in terms of geography, and it's definitely not Iraq in terms of population. There are about 90 million Iranians. It is a huge, huge country. It has massive mountain ranges. It has a lot of things that just make a big overland push from wherever going into Iran to Tehran itself virtually impossible. It is very difficult to conceive of any way that could be done. And certainly we've seen no buildup of forces or anything like that would indicate that there was ever any consideration for that. So I'm just going to take that off the table. That's not what we're going to see. But we might see some other things. There's the Strait of Hormuz is an ongoing situation. If you're familiar with the geography of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz and around that area, there are a number of key islands that play a very strategic role in controlling the strait. One of those is one that the UAE reportedly attacked. Didn't just sit there in the defense, but they actually attacked. And there are reports that Saudi Arabia may have done something akin to that, more offensive action. So our Gulf allies are not just sitting there getting hit with drones and missiles. they're apparently striking back, and I would expect that to continue. And if there was an intent to, secure these islands, to deny them to the Iranians so the Iranians can't use them to harass and attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz, then perhaps the U.S. would go in and do something. Perhaps the U.S. could conduct some amphibious raids and assaults. But at the end of the day, I don't think we want U.S. boots on the ground indefinitely. And it would make sense to have our Gulf allies actually as the ones controlling those islands. So that's a distinct possibility. I think that could happen. Now, there is a big threat of what the Iranians could do to Gulf infrastructure, what they could do to the oil, natural gas, liquefied natural gas. And one of the things I really think we should pay attention to is the desalination capabilities of these very wealthy Gulf states. They are very vulnerable. Think about what happens if Dubai loses its desalination capability. There are no big rivers going into Dubai. There is no huge freshwater source within the UAE that keeps Dubai going. The way Dubai goes is they desalinate a lot of water, and those desalination plants are vulnerable. They're not in big underground bunkers where they can withstand endless missile and drone strikes. They're open and out, and it's not that every drone and every missile aimed at the UAE is going to get through, but they don't have to get a lot to get through before you could have some significant devastation that could hinder or perhaps effectively destroy that desalination capability. So think about what happens there. At that point, there have to be considerations about doing some massive lift of water, and there really aren't the facilities to do that. Or you're going to have to talk about maybe evacuating large chunks of the population in Dubai. But either way, Dubai ceases to be this global commercial center if they don't have water for people to drink and to use. So that is a significant thing. And certainly if I was in the United Arab Emirates, I would be thinking very, very hard about that. We saw what happened earlier in the war when Iran attacked Qatar's natural gas fields and, them attacking other similar types of facilities, and recognize this is a vulnerability that goes across the Gulf. The duration of time for recovery, the cost, the impact of strikes on this critical infrastructure, the threat of these critical infrastructure capabilities going offline for any period of time, that needs to be factored in. And I think it has been factored in, and that's part of the reluctance to return to kinetic action. Also, we are recognizing that there's been a tremendous pull so far. I mean, the administration has had to go before Congress, where they said we're basically about close to $30 billion in cost for this. Now, stated was that we're going to pull 5,000 troops out of Germany, and that's because we're frustrated with the Germans, less than supportive rhetoric on what the U.S. is doing in Iran and their reluctance to provide support for our war in Iran. At least that was what was stated. Okay, but then we turned around shortly afterwards and said, we're going to pull 4,000 troops going to Poland. And that made no sense. Poland has been doing everything the U.S. has asked its NATO allies to do. They have almost, that 5% goal that all the NATO countries agreed to, that they're eventually going to get to 5% of GDP investment in defense. Poland is almost there. They have been very forthcoming, very generous with stationing troops in Poland, and they're one of the most cost-effective places to station troops anywhere in Europe. So it makes sense that we do stuff in Poland. So pulling forces out of Poland didn't make a lot of sense, and they certainly weren't doing something where they were going out there and overtly criticizing the U.S. for what we're doing in the Strait of Hormuz or with Iran or anything like that. They've actually just didn't make any sense at all. But what did make sense was came afterward were reports that were sourced to came from Pentagon officials that apparently the problem was funding. That this $30 billion, that wasn't something Congress got together and said, here's another $30 or $50 billion to do this war with Iran. We're doing this, but we're doing it out of hide. And somewhere they had to figure out where do they cut those costs. And so it sounds like, at least at the Secretary of War office or SecDef office, that someone decided, well, let's curtail some of these European deployments since we're trying to pull back stuff from Europe anyway. And of course, this thing with Poland got on the list, stopping troops deploying to Poland for this deal. And of course, this caused such a sharp rebuke within Congress, particularly GOP members of Congress, and with our NATO allies and certainly allies around the world going, what are you doing? Can we rely on you for anything if you're going to do stuff like this? That had to get reversed. And then all of a sudden, President Trump came out, I think yesterday, and said, no, we're going to send 5,000 troops to Poland. And he cited the recent election of the Polish president, which was somebody he liked. But now you got another problem, which is, okay, so the U.S. support of our European allies is contingent on whether we like the last results of their internal elections. Are we saying that we should be the ones making the call on who they elect? There's a lot of issues that kind of are implied with that position as well. Whether you're right, left, or whatever, I'm just saying that's what we've said, and that's certainly how the Europeans are going to kind of interpret that. So this war with Iran has had second, third order effects that maybe we didn't fully understand across the board. And I'll be the first to say, look, there are reasons why this administration has been a little tough on NATO, has rhetorically been very tough on NATO, questioned what NATO's doing. And certainly a lot of those European nations have been getting essentially a free ride based on U.S. security guarantees. And those days are over. But this thing with Poland just left everybody scratching their head. And that appears to have been directly resultant from the cost of maintaining that huge military commitment dealing with the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, and with Iran. Now, let me switch gears. The other possibility is we're coming close to an agreement. And that's exactly what the White House has been saying. It is kind of what the Iranians have been sort of saying, not quite the same way, but that we're getting close. However, what this is being described is a memorandum of understanding for a peace agreement. Now, an MOU is, generally speaking, states our understanding. It's very difficult to enforce. It is not an MOU, a memorandum of agreement. It is definitely not an agreement, and it is not a treaty. So this is a memorandum of understanding for this, and Iran has said that this is with the intent to put a framework together for negotiations. All right. Now, in a rather lengthy Truth Social post for the White House, from the Oval Office, President Trump said he completed major conference calls with leaders throughout the region: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain. I didn't see Kuwait listed, but I'm sure it was. And regarding the ongoing negotiations with Tehran. And what he said was that an agreement had been largely negotiated subject to finalization between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic and the various other countries involved. But again, this is a memorandum of understanding for an agreement. So I guess when he says agreement, he must be using it with a little a, because this is not an MOA. It will be an MOU. Now, the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman confirmed that Tehran and Washington were in the final stage of drafting a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, and that's what he called it. All right. He indicated this would temporarily defer continuous disputes surrounding Iran's nuclear program for another 30 to 60 days. Yes, that became a political red flag for many members of Congress. I'll get to that in a second. And focus on immediately ending the fighting. Now, you're sitting there going, okay, he didn't say anything about their nuclear program. He didn't say anything about completely reopening the Strait of Hormuz. He didn't say anything about support to proxy terrorist organizations in the region. Just said ending the current fighting. All right. And basically says what Iran's saying is at this stage, our entire focus is on ending the war, period. All right. And that the positions of the two sides are becoming closer. That's diplomatic speech for nothing is actually happening, by the way. And now, despite this diplomatic process that's being alluded to, there's a lot of skepticism out there, and particularly amongst Republicans in Congress, many of whom are foreign policy hawks. They've been out there very vocal in their support of the war in Iran and why we have to do this war. And also a lot of Israeli officials who are very concerned that whatever this is could give Tehran a strategic victory after all this fighting and all these months of, dare I say, military pressure. Senator Lindsey Graham, definitely a defense hawk, definitely very conservative, very close to President Trump himself personally, put out an X post that he needs that, any deal with Iran could be perceived as, allowing Tehran to retain long-term leverage, all right, over the Strait of Hormuz, or the Gulf oil infrastructure being permanently vulnerable to Iranian attack. And that if this is the case, this would really shift the regional balance of power in the area. All right. I'm going to quote this. I'm going to read it. If a deal is struck to end the Iranian conflict because it is believed that the Strait of Hormuz cannot be protected from Iranian terrorism, that's what he wrote, then Iran will be perceived as being a dominant force requiring a diplomatic solution. And he talked about the danger that perception posed. And, particularly when you look at Hezbollah and Lebanon, and you look at the other proxy forces throughout the region. All right. Now, with that, there are reports in Israeli television, Channel 12 particularly, that they believe that U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff is attempting to secure an agreement with Iran at, quote, at any cost, unquote. And that has caused them great angst as far as Iran getting a perceived political victory, certainly a propaganda victory from this war. Mark Dubowitz, the CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, and I've been on numerous news shows on panels with FDD experts over the many years. And he's warned that a 60-day ceasefire extension based on vague Iranian promises of trying to basically negotiate something would basically destroy U.S. leverage across the board. And if it's some vague agreement to discuss Iran's nuclear situation, he kind of considers that sort of game over, that basically we have given up doing serious discussion on curtailing their ability. Now, Iran, despite everything you just heard, the farce, which is really kind of a semi-official news agency for the regime, pushed out a statement which kind of pushed back on what President Trump had just said, saying, labeling his claims of this thing being close to stuff about the Strait of Hormuz as, quote, far from reality, unquote. So even within Tehran, they're saying this thing isn't really as close as you think it is, despite what you're saying. This really does bring into question what has been said and how it's being said and how it's being articulated. So the question is whether there is something actually about to be done. Will President Trump resume strikes, resume kinetic action, or is he, basically trying to secure an agreement, to what was alluded to Steve Witkoff, at any cost, unquote, which would essentially be perceived as we're trying to cut and run from what's going on over there. And if he does go forth with this ostensibly weak memorandum of understanding approach, at least that's the way it's being described. I'm not passing my judgment one way or another. I'm just saying this is what people are saying. It is being perceived as being a kind of a weak MOU approach, that he may end up losing support by a lot of GOP members of the Senate and probably some GOP members of the House, particularly those that went out there very forcefully articulating why we're in Iran to begin with, because essentially they will feel that they politically just had the rug pulled out from under them. And that is obviously a big concern when you talk about a midterm year. And obviously Israel would not be thrilled to see us not finish the job and to ignore what their positions are. So there's a lot going on there in terms of what this could eventually lead to. It's I would say, even if you're a very strong Trump supporter, you might want to take pause and listen to some other very strong Trump supporters and what they're saying about this particular proposed memorandum of understanding sort of thing across the board. Although I will be the first to say, returning to kinetic warfare certainly has a high risk associated with it, particularly for the Gulf states. And so there's a lot that goes on there. It's a long way of saying that President Trump is at a strategic inflection point, and there is a big question about who has his ear right now. There is a price to be paid, a huge political price, if it's perceived that he was trying to get out of this war with Iran through a series of half measures. It could be, honestly, for him, politically catastrophic. If you're listening to, Senator Wicker, Senator Graham, they have been, I have to say, that's some of the strongest language I've heard them say so far, which didn't come out and really, it didn't condemn the president outright, but it was very clear that they were not on board with what he's saying. And these are very influential senators. So there is a price to be paid for that. And then again, there's a price to be paid for a return to kinetic action, as we talked about earlier. And I will say this is reminding me a lot of President Bush's situation in 2000. We all know what came out of that. So I just find this to be a really, really interesting weekend and week coming up. And we are at a big shift in one way or the other of how this goes. And I think we need to watch what happens this weekend. We need to watch what's coming up this week. But hopefully after listening to this, maybe I've kind of filled in a few gaps in terms of some of the underlying rationale, one way or the other, some of the implications, one way or the other, of whichever way this thing goes. And hopefully that helps you in your informing your own thoughts as to what this is. And of course, those thoughts will turn into actions. For some of you out there, it'll probably turn into investment actions, business actions, things like that. Thanks for listening to STRAT. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. You can go to the, obviously we have a YouTube channel with STRAT, but also Hal Kempfer TV. And you can always go to my website at www.gripsa.com. And also, if you're going to the Los Angeles Infragard website, which is www.infragard, INFRAGARD, losangeles.org. You will see that I have an upcoming strategic threat update coming up in June, and my webinar on gray area threats is currently something that's playing in Encore. So if you're curious to hear more about what I have to say about these things, much more in depth than what I cover in STRAT or on the air, please go ahead and register and take those things, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we have a Facebook account for STRAT at facebook.com/STRAT podcast, and that's another portal and way that you can get in there and find out all the STRAT things we're talking about. And hopefully the goal of this is to help you in your strategic thinking, your strategic approach across the board. Thanks, and hope you tune into the next one.